from. It's just truly a joy to watch, and thank our fans around the world, 215 countries and territories that will be able to tune into these games. So with that, Tim, happy to answer any questions.
Okay, just a reminder for our friends on Zoom, use the raise hand function if you have any questions. We're going to start in the room in the back left with Tim Reynolds.
Hi, Adam. It's really good to see you.
You too,
especially now.
Yeah, you too.
You're right. It has been great to see the buildings filled during the postseason. Obviously, that wasn't the case for much of the regular season. Can you kind of address how you expect the league will have come out of this season financially, how the teams will have come out of it financially, and as a semi-unrelated part of that, would you expect that the Raptors will be able to start next season at home? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Tim. Great to see you in person as well. Let me begin with the Raptors question. It's unclear yet. I know on behalf of Larry Tannenbaum, who's the governor of the team and happens to be the chairman of the board of the NBA, he's very hopeful that Ontario will open up and that they'll be able to have the team back in Toronto. I know it's incredibly meaningful to the team. I mean, I think there was that yet additional burden placed on the Raptors more than any other team by having to relocate for the season. But we are hopeful the team will be back if things continue as we're seeing in Canada right now. Financially, for the season, without getting into it too specifically, we did somewhat better than we initially projected. As you recall, I think I had said at the beginning of the season that roughly 40% of our typical revenue is attributed to not just ticket sales, but those revenue streams that come from the related activities in arenas. Because of our ability to get fans back in the arenas for the playoffs, as great as that's been, it's a relatively small portion of the season in terms of number of games. So I think now we don't have the exact numbers yet, but maybe we'll be down, roughly a third in revenue, something around there instead of 40%. And so no question that the league will incur significant losses for the past 2 years. I will say, though, I'm not here to complain about that. I think speaking for our team owners, they view it as a long-term investment in the league and something very necessary to keep these organizations going. And by the way, it was shared sacrifice by our players as well, just based on the way our system works. We work something out with the Players Association where, they all took, frankly, all the players took significant reductions this season. We were able to, in essence, advance some of the money they otherwise would have, will be getting in future seasons by spreading out the deductions so that they were able to make a little bit over the percentage. But it was definitely a shared sacrifice. But I feel, again, if things continue on track and we could move towards a new season next year that looks a lot more like normal, I think we'll have weathered it very well. And I think and have to me, an incredibly strong partnership with our players and coaches and referees and all the affiliated constituent groups, and having all work closely together to come through this.
All right, next second row, Lisa Shu.
Lisa Su from Tencent. Good to see you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
I have two questions. First, where do you see the relationship between China and the NBA going in next year or two? And then second question, do you consider having Asia League like Africa League in the future?
Take the second part of your question first. Some number of years ago, we had discussions with the Chinese Basketball Association, which of course is now led by Yao Ming, about potentially partnering on a league. That's nothing we've talked about all that much in the last few years. I think the Chinese Basketball Association continues to thrive under Yao's direction. And that'd be my expectation, that they will remain independent of the NBA. In terms of the future of our relationship with China, meaning the NBA's, I mean, of course, it's hard to divorce what's happening with the NBA from larger geopolitical issues, between the US and China. I do think it remains important that, particularly when tensions are high between governments, that we foster these sports, educational, cultural relationships. I've said that from the very beginning. It certainly doesn't mean that we are blessing everything that happens in China, by any means. And we are at root an American company. And so we follow US government policy. But it's my expectation that we will continue to distribute our games in China through your service, Tencent, and others, and that we can play a productive role in helping the people of the United States and the people of China have a better understanding of each other and see that we're all human beings and that there is commonality between us. And I think that form of engagement is critically important if we're going to work together to try to resolve some of our issues. And those issues include dealing with future pandemics and dealing with global climate issues and economic issues and human rights issues, that they have to begin from a point of discussions directly with each other. And I think to the extent that, through sports, that, again, as I said, that's something that we can at least find common ground on. I continue to believe we can play a positive role.
Right next to Lisa, we got Sam.
Adam, good seeing you.
Good to see you, Sam.
Two specific areas. I'm just wondering the future of them. The play-in tournament seemingly was a hit. LeBron was not a fan, and this year in particular, he kind of pushed back on a few areas. That one, where does that leave you going forward? Do you see it, existing as it did? But also expansion. It seemed, my understanding was that on the owner level, as the revenues dipped, that expansion was, looked at pretty seriously in terms of a possible uplift revenue wise. But now that you've leveled out and things are a little bit better, how do you see that front?
Sure. So first, on the play-in tournament, it's my expectation that we'll continue it for next season. We both, of course, need agreement from our teams and the Players Association. And I know, Michelle Roberts doesn't have an easy job. She has 450 players. Some maybe have louder voices than others at the table. But again, I think ultimately, although there were critics, not just LeBron, but others who weren't in favor of it, and maybe some teams who weren't thrilled with it, I think overall it was very positive, for the league and the players. I mean, certainly there have been some suggestions about some tweaks we should consider. But again, I think once we bring it back to our owners for a vote and the Players Association meets and has an opportunity to consider it, it's my expectation that it'll continue for next season. In terms of expansion, I know that was reported that, when revenues were down, we were looking more seriously at expansion. I mean, it didn't work exactly like that, largely because expansion's a multi-year process. So it wasn't as if, the pandemic came, we're 40% down, we can quickly collect some expansion revenue. So, yes, it's true that we actually had some time while we were initially shut down and we were meeting more often with our teams to think a little bit more about it. But it seemed the consensus was certainly during a pandemic, that wasn't the right time to expand, but that we should continue to consider it. I'll say, what I think it's lost sometimes is that from an economic standpoint, from the way the league looks at it, is that we're in essence selling equity in the league. You have 30 partners and just say hypothetically expanded by 2 more teams, then you'd have 32 partners. So the extent you have a national television deal or global television rights, instead of it being divided 30 ways, it's divided 32 ways. So it's sort of cash up front, depending on what you sell the expansion team for, but it's not necessarily the windfall that I think people think it is. The most important considerations for us when we look at expansion is, will it ultimately grow the pie? Meaning, and it's potentially 30 more jobs if you expand with 2 teams, you expand the league's footprint. How does that help us in varying ways, sort of increase support nationally? So we'll continue to look at it. I mean, I've said this many times before. I mean, we're certainly not suggesting we're locked at 30 teams. I think at some point it'll make sense to expand, but it's just not at the top of the agenda right now.
Second row on the right, Jared.
Hi, Commissioner. Jared Greenberg, NBA TV.
Hey, Jared.
Following up on your opening remarks, can you tell us where you are in your conversations with the teams at this point regarding player rest and load management for next season?
We haven't addressed it so specifically for next season, only because I think as we watch what's happening with COVID, we're mindful that as much as I want to sort of close the book and say we've lived through it. Of course, I'm reading the same stories you all are, about Delta variants and other things. I mean, again, I'm very hopeful we're going to put it behind us, but that could have an impact on how we schedule rest. I will say, again, this is not something that's been talked a lot about in the context of injuries, but resting is up over 100% this season from last season. And the issue which we're trying to get to the root of is, does resting work, frankly? Does load management work? I mean, and there's different theories out there on it. And what's most surprising, as I said, it's not just about injuries up this season. We've seen this upward trend for several years. And you'd like to believe that with the investment, the level of sophistication, the number of, doctors, like the amount of analytics we look at, that the data we're able to collect that we couldn't in the old days, that we, putting the pandemic aside, would have seen improvements, and we haven't seen that yet. And so, I mean, part of it, of course, load management or resting, there's an economic impact on that. There's no doubt that if you're, and I understand it from a fan standpoint. I mean, they want to see their teams advance, and they're even sympathetic to a certain amount of rest, but they don't necessarily want to pay the same price for the ticket if the stars aren't playing, or whatever television programming looks like in the future in terms of how people are charged for it. So they might be both rooting for rest, but saying the game doesn't have the same value. And I think we got to find the right sort of midpoint there between, clearly if players hardly played at all, there would be a dramatic reduction, presumably, in the amount of injuries. Although we see a lot of off-season injuries now. We see a lot of injuries during training. And load management isn't just a function of how many minutes in a game a player plays, but how much, what else they're, what other burdens they're putting on their bodies when they're not playing, and how hard they're training and what they're doing in the off season. So nothing could be more important for our league than keeping, especially a league where stars drive so much of the interest of keeping them on the floor longer. So my only thing on load management is sometimes I think people just accept, to me, in a sort of non-scientific way, that load management works. It's just not all that clear. And I think it's another area where historically some of the teams have thought about their medical protocols as kind of their secret sauce. And I think at least there's a recognition now, especially players have shorter contracts. There's more movement of players, that we all have a common interest in players staying healthy, and that we should, in the same way we have in many business areas in the league, be looking at best practices when it comes to rehabilitation and training of our players. So it will remain a focus on the league, but and again, what the optimal number of games are in the season. As I said, we've had this 82 game season for 50 plus years. I mean, is 82 optimal? It's interesting. We got this experiment during the pandemic to move to 72. Everybody thought that was the cure-all if we just lopped 10 games off the season. I mean, obviously injuries are up, so that wasn't it. Now it's just one data point, but this is one that requires a lot more study.
Fifth row on the left, Mark.
Hi, Commissioner Mark Medina, USA Today. Good to see you.
You too.
Once all the head coaching positions are filled, what's your expectation on how much more representation there will be among Black and women coaches?
Well, in terms of Black coaches, obviously we've seen positive developments there in terms of the number of vacancies that are being filled. I will say that, not unlike a lot of organizations that are dealing with diversity issues, this is something that requires daily attention. So, again, positive movement in that direction. But, we're not going to rest on our laurels there. It's something that, back to the point about data, it's something that's a regular part of our team meetings, of our board of governors meetings now, not just in the coaching ranks, but across the league, and making sure teams are focused on it, and that we're also working collectively to develop pools of future general managers like James Jones, and future great coaches like Monty. It's so that's part of the work that we have to do. In terms of women, it's a little bit frustrating. It's an area where even just looking around the room here, it's like you'd like to see more women represented in the room here today in all aspects of our business. And that's, we've historically made more progress in race rather than on gender. But I think that's beginning to change. It's slow, it's frustrating, but it's the work that we have to do every day to change awareness and develop pools of candidates as well.
Middle of the room, Mark Spears.
Adam, good to
Mark,
see you.
you too.
Mark Spears, ESPN's Undefeated. When you can look back at the bubble in those 3 days when the Bucks sparked a layoff for 3 days after Kenosha, how do you reflect back on that, and what do you think about what the NBA has done since then to live up to what the players wanted you to do from a social justice standpoint?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Mark. I'd say I'm proud of our players. I think that they used that platform that they had in Orlando to bring global attention to those issues, and that they also came together. It was, as you know, a bit divisive initially, but they came together as a group. And I thought in a very constructive way to think about how we could use this league to further a social justice agenda, and at the same time play basketball, which is what we managed to do down in Orlando. I think and to me, I didn't see it so much as player demands on the league. I saw it as an opportunity to jointly address the impact that the combination of our players and team owners could have together. And what came out of not just the incident in Kenosha, but George Floyd's killing was, in addition to enormously heightened awareness of those issues, I'll just speak for the league, and conversations, many of which had never been had and should have been had many years earlier, but the NBA Foundation and the $300 million commitment from our governors to create, I hope, initial funding for it and something that can grow much larger. The National Basketball Social Justice Coalition, that came directly out of that moment in the bubble, which was a recognition that it's not just about money, but we need to have more of a legislative agenda as well. That, again, working, I think, uniquely together, that certainly the players always could have just gone off and created a lobbying organization or done whatever they're on their own, and the owners could have done their own thing. But I think there was a realization that if we work together, we can be incredibly powerful. And since then, we hired an executive director, James Cadogan, who's recently in the job and doing a fantastic job. Greg Taylor, who came in on in the NBA Foundation, a longtime NBA player. So longtime NBA employee. So it's we're making progress, and I think though that it was important to create those institutions, I think that could sort of focus on these issues full time, and that we saw a real opportunity there to make a difference. And again, it's early days, and in part because we've all been living under these pandemic protocols, I do think, just like having, all of us together today, in-person gatherings are important. I mean, to try to persuade people to talk to people who may disagree with you, and that we haven't been able to do for the most part. It's largely been through virtual meetings. So I know that, both Greg and James, and leading their boards and coalitions, I think we need to get people in the same room and really talk about, make priorities and where we can have the most impact from a societal standpoint.
Okay, we're going to take a couple questions from Zoom. We'll start with Davide.
Hey, Commissioner, Davide Chinellato here with La Gazzetta dello Sport in Italy. Good to see you virtually.
Good to see you. Thank you.
You say the league is trying to get back to normalcy with, the next season and the 82 games. When do you expect global games to be part of that return to normalcy?
Well, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for your question. I think most realistically, it's clear it's not going to happen this fall, but it's my hope that it'll be the following year. Again, of course, this is a global issue, COVID. And so it's not just conditions here in the United States, but the places, at least where we've traditionally played in Europe and Asia and in Latin America, we would need COVID rates to come way down there as well. And I think to understand what the new normal is going to be. But it is my hope that, as we can move in the US back to something that looks very close to normal next year, and then the following seasons we'll return to our international activities.
Okay, we'll take a question from Zoom. Kevin Draper.
Hey, Adam. Kevin Draper from the New York Times.
Hey,
I was wondering what your reaction is to the news about ESPN's turmoil over the past year, given the relationship the NBA has with the network and the widespread reaction we've seen from current and former players to the comments from Rachel Nichols and Adam Mendelsohn.
It's disheartening. I'm really not in a position to speak too specifically about what goes on at ESPN because so much of my information came from your newspaper's reporting and others. So I'm not privy to much more beyond that. I will say, apropos of my earlier comments, I think it's particularly unfortunate that two women in the industry are pitted against each other. I know that, both Rachel and Maria are terrific at what they do. They work extraordinarily hard. And it's as I said, I think just from the league standpoint, recognize, well, ESPN's operations are independent of us. I feel we're all part of a family here in terms of what we do around our sport. And I hope, I think part of the problem is that, as I said earlier, when people can't get in a room and talk through these issues, this seemingly has fostered now for a full year. I mean, this is an incident that happened, I guess, when Rachel was in the bubble a year ago. And I would have thought that in the past year, maybe through some incredibly difficult conversations, that ESPN would have found a way to be able to work through it. Obviously not. I should also say too, that these issues are not unique to ESPN. As I said, the league, is working on its own issues in terms of doing a better job with diversity. And it's not just in sports, but in companies around America. There's a reckoning going on, and I think part of it and what we're seeing in ESPN, it's one thing to talk about the principles around diversity and inclusion. It's something else when it comes to somebody's specific job and how that's handled. And what I've learned from dealing with these issues of the NBA is that they are incredibly complex. There's no magic bullets here, and they require a very labor-intensive effort of getting people in the room and working through these issues by talking a lot about them and then talking even more about them and creating a climate where people are comfortable, saying what's on their mind, where people are given the benefit of the doubt, especially long-term employees that are in good standing, that when they do make comments, that people recognize that people make mistakes, that careers shouldn't be erased, by a single comment, that we should be judging people by the larger context of their body of work and who they are and what we know about them. So, I have confidence in the leadership of ESPN and of course, and in my Disney colleagues. And so they will work through this, but I'm sure this is a very difficult time for them. And it's really unfortunate what we're seeing in sports. I'd say one of the differences from sports from most other businesses, including usually the media, is that it doesn't play out so publicly. We all familiar with issues that have happened in workplaces, but they're handled by human resources department, and people are quietly brought into rooms and they work through them, and people, and people are, can talk these things through. It's when things are playing out in the media and then on social media, it's incredibly difficult for everyone involved. And, again, I hope that the folks at ESPN are able to continue to work through these. We appreciate our partnership with them and the coverage, again, from both Rachel and Maria. I mean, they're incredibly devoted to the NBA. They're both fantastic at what they do. And this is just a really unfortunate situation, especially coming at this moment in time when we'd like all the folks to be on the players on the floor. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go back to the room. We'll take three more, starting with Ramona.
Ramona Shelburne, ESPN. Just wondering, we've all arrived at this place and we keep talking about this idea of getting back to normal. But I'm wondering, like all of us who are sort of confronting that thought, what parts of normal do you want to get back to, and what parts do you want to leave behind? Just from this whole year, starting from maybe even March 11th of last year.
Sure. So certainly one part of normal we want to get back to is full arenas with fans. I think it's part of the NBA experience. We've talked about this before, that there aren't that many places, even pre-pandemic in society, where people gather in the way they do in arenas, in relatively intimate settings, and it's to come together for a common purpose. And I miss that a lot. I think also, whether it's the arts or in sports, people literally breathe each other's air. When you think about what NBA players were doing in a pandemic, which is why it required so much testing. I mean, think of how many other workplaces where people go in, mask off, and they go this close to their colleague, and and literally like breathing into each other's mouths in many cases. And so I think that's part of the human connection. So I really do miss that. I think there are things we've learned though about flexibility in workplaces, that I certainly am someone that pre-pandemic, in my almost 30 years at the league, probably hardly been a week of my tenure where I didn't travel somewhere. I think we'll see probably less travel in the future for certain kinds of meetings that we can do. It doesn't mean that in-person meetings aren't incredibly important, but maybe people will value those meetings even more and treasure that time together. I think that will be really important. I think what I hope we're able to maintain the sense of partnership that we've had in this community. I mean, particularly with the Players Association, and seems like almost poetic justice that Chris Paul, as president of the Players Association, someone I was on the phone with at least once a week since March 11th of 2020, is here in the finals. He devoted an enormous amount of his personal time to leading the players. Not an easy job, not without criticism. And so that sense of unity, I hope we can keep up, and I see no reason why we won't. I think the players have a better understanding of sort of what we're up against in trying to run this business. And I think we have a better understanding of the players and what it's like to travel the amount they do, and to the stresses they're under, the emotional and physical burdens they're under by competing at this level. And hopefully we can continue to build on that.
First row on the right, Dwayne.
Yes, Dwayne Rankin, Arizona Republic. Good to see you.
You too.
Couple points. One, what do you think of the Suns' run that they've had to get here? And then two, just looking at the season overall, what do you feel like is the one thing you guys got right, and the one thing that you're like, we could have done that better?
Sure. The first question's a little easier. So the Suns' run, of course, began in the bubble with that 8-0 streak that they were on. It was a close call. They were right on the margin, in terms of whether they were going to come to Orlando. And I'm sure when they look back on the team, regardless of what happens in the finals, when they look back on their season, I think there's no doubt that had a real impact. Them sort of seeing they could compete at a high level and come together like that as a team, even before the addition of Chris Paul. Boy, in terms of what we did right and wrong, as I said earlier, I think it's too early to make these judgments, because I think it may turn out that things that I thought we did right turn out to be completely wrong. I just think there's still so much that's potentially not known about this virus, about what aspects of the lockdown were necessary. Maybe we should have shut down other parts of our business that we weren't aware of. So I'd say the one thing I feel, same answer I gave to Ramona, that I really think we did right, is building on a partnership with our players, with Michelle Roberts and the Players Association, with her executive committee, and really talking through some very difficult issues. I think similar to my response to an earlier question, that, we went into a lot of these negotiations with the players, not even honestly knowing what our position was. It was sort of, well, here's the obstacle. Let's talk through the right way to get to the other side. How is this going to affect players? How are they going to feel about it? How will they feel about being in a bubble? I mean, certainly at this point, looking back on the last year and a half, the bubble seems to have been very effective. In terms of this season, whether we started at the right time and whether we were right to conclude, by July 22nd, I still maintain that balancing all these various issues, that was still the best outcome out of a variety of unpopular decisions. That it was the best way to balance those factors, but it's unclear. And I accept the criticism. It's part of the job, whether it comes from players or the media or others. And we'll see. And maybe we'll take a few years to really look back on the season to really understand what we did right and what we did wrong.
Final question, fifth row, second in, Jim.
Hey, Adam. Jim Ozarski, Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Nice to meet you. It was just less than a decade ago, there was real concern about the franchise viability in Milwaukee and whether it could stay there. So can you speak to a little bit of this ownership group, what they've done and meant to the franchise viability, and then also just in general, what it means to the NBA to have Phoenix and Milwaukee represented in the finals?
Well, Jim, to your point about roughly a decade ago, and this is another area where Senator Cole deserves a lot of credit. He led an effort to create a more robust revenue sharing system in the league. It was part and parcel of a new CBA that we entered into 2011. But I thought those two sides of the coin together are what enabled smaller market teams to better compete in the league. And so again, Senator Cole, deserves much of that credit. I think though that he set out to find a group to pass the team to that would have the same love of Milwaukee that he did and a commitment to keeping the team there, but also had the wherewithal. And it's not just financial resources, but the technical wherewithal. And that's something I mentioned Mike Fascitelli earlier as one of their owners with a strong construction background to make possible the development of the arena that they did. So, it's a model what they've created both now. Certainly I was able to say that before the season, a model in terms of the business, but now a model from a basketball standpoint as well. And to have Phoenix and Milwaukee, of course, one team that hadn't won a championship in 50 years, one team that hadn't won a championship, and for people to see the viability of the competition in this league, not just from independent of market size, but also in some cases independent of top picks in the draft. And not to say, of course, there's a correlation, between quality on the floor and top picks, but whether it's Giannis or Devin, picks out of the top five come in and become all-stars, become accomplished players in the way they are. Also just, multi-dimensional people, with just great personalities and interests far beyond basketball. It's a dream for the league. And it's something, again, I realize that it's one data point in one season. So I'm not here to say our problems are all solved, but I think it's very positive. It's very, and of course, just a wonderful vibe, both here in Phoenix and I know in Milwaukee as well. I was there recently for a playoff game. It's just great to see.
All right. Thank you, Adam. And thanks to all of you on Zoom and in the room. It's great to see all of you again. And we'll have transcripts up on Media Central relatively shortly. Enjoy game one.
Thank you, everyone.